Welcome back everyone. Let's go ahead and take a look at the iPad 6th generation and see how this specific iPad holds up in 2022. Now what I will definitely tell you is that this specific iPad is very interesting because internally it kind of has the same specifications as an iPhone 7, but I personally do think this thing was a little bit of a better performing machine than those specific, iPhones, mostly because of the battery size inside. I like the build quality of these iPads as well, but also for the price tag that this thing was at this time. Although 2018 it was 4 years ago and the iPhone 7s came out in 2016, so this thing had like a 2-year-old chipset. I think for the price tag that this thing had within it, it still makes this thing a pretty decent performing iPad. There's some weird things about this thing going in the future, but I still think if you own an iPad 6, I think it's still a pretty decent iPad. But going up to something like the iPad 7, 8, or 9th generation are very good updates in my opinion. It's very funny because this was kind of the last generation of that 9.7-inch iPad, mostly because basically every iPad after this had a 10.2-inch display. So those were, I think, much better panels, and that iPad 9th generation now is a very good iPad. I love that iPad a lot. But with this iPad that came out in 2018, the body of it still looks and feels pretty good too. You had a 9.7-inch IPS panel on the front. The resolution was actually pretty high, and this was something that was actually pretty interesting to me. With this type of panel, it didn't have True Tone, it didn't have 120 Hz or anything, but it wasn't a bad panel, and the resolution of these panels are actually fairly large. Now you also have a little bit of bezel around the display, which isn't horrible. It doesn't look ugly by any means. You have that front facing camera, you have that home button, on the front as well. But I still think this is a pretty good looking panel, and I think it's actually one of my favorite things about this iPad. The panel of this thing is actually pretty good. Now we did have a lightning port at the bottom of this thing, and we had a headphone jack as well, which still looked very good. And we have the full aluminum back as well. And the back of this thing, personally, I think still looks pretty good. You have that Apple logo in the center of it as well. And there's no IP certification, no wireless charging, but no other iPad really has it either. And this thing had a single camera setup on the back too, which we will go ahead and hit on right now. It had that 8 megapixel standard lens on the back, and it had a 1.2 megapixel standard lens on the front. Now what I will definitely tell you about this type of camera is that it's definitely in that market where it's not like the best performing camera anymore, and it's not necessarily a camera that I would recommend picking up because it's like an iPhone 6 camera. That's probably the best way to put it. This is a camera in which you're just glad that the iPad even had a camera to begin with. If you have something like an iPhone 7, that is going to be a better camera. And the reason I bring up the iPhone 7 so much more is mostly because the iPhone 7 has 4K at 60 and it has the same chipset as this thing. And the reason I bring up the iPhone 7 is because this thing has the same internals pretty much as an iPhone 7. So something like that is going to be giving you a better experience. But with this type of camera, again, I'm glad that it had a camera built in. If you want to take quick Google Meet calls or FaceTime calls or whatever other group meeting applications you have, well, this isn't a bad option. And I do like having an iPad just sitting around there like this. If you want to go ahead and quickly take a quick photo or something, or you don't have your iPhone with you, but most of the time an iPhone is going to be a much better camera, and iPhone 7 Plus is a way better camera than this thing as well. So again, this is on par with something like an iPhone 6, and iPad cameras have never been notoriously been the best cameras that Apple makes. It's always been their iPhones, but I'm still glad that this thing has a camera within it, and that's kind of all I have to say about that. Now, one of the more interesting aspects of this device has to be the software. So iPadOS is great. I love iPadOS. I feel like Apple can do a lot more with it, so they're just kind of waiting around. I don't know what they're waiting around for. But a big, massive thing to keep in mind about the iPad 6th generation is that this iPad theoretically could end up getting, unsupported with software sooner rather than later. Now, I do think these A10 Fusion chip devices could probably end somewhere around maybe iOS 17. I feel like Apple's going to be giving us maybe one more version of software on top just because so many devices support this specific chipset. We have the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus. We have this iPad 6th generation. We have, I think, like a HomePod has that A10 Fusion or some other, weird device like that. The iPad Pro 10.5-inch had an A10 Fusion chip inside of it too. So this thing has a chipset that many other devices have, and that iPod 7th generation that also has an A10 Fusion chip too. So there are several different devices that have this chipset. So the reason that's important is because you have something like that iPad, 10.5-inch, the iPod, and the iPhones that have that same chipset. So because of that, I would probably recommend, seeing if you want to avoid this iPad just because of that situation. Because this iPad has that type of situation going on with it, you're going to be in a much better situation going up to something like that, iPad iPad 7th generation or 8th or 9th gen. So that's kind of what I would tell you in the software standpoint. That's probably one of the more concerning portions of this iPad. Now, there could be a moment where this iPad could end up maybe getting another 2 years of support, but even that isn't a crazy amount. So unless you're getting a really good deal on the specific iPad, then I would probably recommend kind of, sidestepping away from this iPad and going to that 7th or 8th gen. Those are probably the things that make the most amount of sense to me, in my opinion. So in terms of that covers it up there. Now, in terms of performance, like I mentioned 30 times in this video already, this thing had that Apple A10 Fusion chip inside of it. So same exact thing as the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus, but this thing has 2 gigabytes of RAM. Now, the reason why that's kind of interesting is because the iPhone 7 had 2 gigabytes of RAM, but the 7 Plus had 3 gigabytes of RAM. So theoretically speaking, something like the iPhone 7 Plus may actually end up giving you better experience overall than the iPad 6th generation. Now, for basic tasks, like if you're a student or if you're trying to do like very, very light work, this thing I think is going to be fine for the most part. Even if you're going up to, maybe editing some small videos with an iMovie or editing videos in general, really this iPad is going to be able to do every single thing for the most part that an iPad Pro can do, the latest one. For the most part, again, not everything, but the main things to keep in mind is that it's going to be doing them much slower. So you can do everything, and if you don't care about speed, then this is perfectly fine. For the most part, everything you're going to be able to do on those iPads, you're going to be able to do on here. It's still supported with software. And the reason why that's important is because basically all the applications that are going to be coming out are going to be supported on this type of iPad. So iMovie, if you have, any audio editing software, if you're trying to do any other thing, you're going to be getting a very solid experience from, you're going to be at least having the capability of doing them here. But personally, even when I do things on my iPhone 7 Plus, I do kind of get a, not subpar experience, but a weirder experience. But I do understand that's a 6-year-old phone, and this thing has a 6-year-old chipset. So because of that, again, you're stuck in a strange situation where this thing could have been a little bit better, but I don't think it's a big deal. And I think if you're, somebody who uses like the Apple Pencil a lot, I think this was one of the first iPad, the base generation, to support the Apple Pencil. So I do like that capability, and I think that's awesome. But again, maybe going up to something like the iPad 7th or 8th are probably going to be better options in my opinion. Now, ending it off with the battery life, this thing has a 8,827 milliamp hour battery, and that is a massive size battery to have on an iPad like this. This thing wasn't crazy big performance in the performance department. It didn't have, like the highest resolution ProMotion display. It was a pretty basic iPad for the most part. And because of that, that puts this iPad in a really good situation where it can easily go ahead and pretty much last the test of time in terms of battery. So that gets a thumbs up from me in my books as well. Now, to kind of sum up this whole entire video and to answer the question, I'm going to be completely honest. I think the iPad 6th generation is still worth it for the most part, but there are some areas that concern me with this iPad. So I think the performance segment, the battery, the display, the build quality, those type of things still make a lot of sense to me. And I think that's totally okay. I think this iPad is really, really good in that standpoint. But I do think in the software longevity standpoint and just the longevity aspect in general, I just don't really think this is the iPad I would recommend to a majority of people. I think that 7th generation iPad really did kind of fix everything that was wrong with this. There wasn't anything wrong with it, but it was a pretty big update. And then the 8th generation was also a pretty big update. And then the 9th generation that just came out for $329, that is a substantially better iPad than this thing. That is a really good iPad. So the choice is yours, but I would probably recommend going down that direction, going into the 9th or 8th generation, rather than picking up the 6th generation in my opinion. So that kind of covers it up for the most part. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.